Paul tells us in Ephesians, Christ himself gave the apostles, prophets, the evangelists, the pastors and teachers to equip his people for works of service, so that the body of Christ may be built up.
Today we're bringing you two stories about teachers, students and boats. Angus MacDonald, or Mr. Mac, is a retired head teacher who got into outdoor recreation in his late 30s.
John's Gospel explains that Jesus' disciples and people who knew him called him teacher. Though Mr. Mac did not know the Lord during his career, comparisons can be made between his stories and those in the New Testament.
Welcome to the Divine Nature Podcast. Angus first picked up hill running and quickly started entering races. It started with his local Lomond Hill race, and through friends he found out about the Island Peaks race.
I first took part in the Island Peaks race in 1990. It is 60 miles of hill running up mountains and things, and 200 miles of sailing off the west coast of Scotland.
The route starts in Oban, then takes racers to the islands Mull, Jura and Arran, before finishing back on the mainland in Troon. Teams usually consist of 2 fell runners and 3 sailors, who all work round the clock for 3 to 4 days. The runners have checkpoints to reach on the hills of each island, and the sailors have to coordinate the timings of the North Atlantic, the Sound of Mull and the Firth of the Clyde, with the runners increasing fatigue. The rules of the race include a strict kit list, which all runners must carry on their backs. Warm clothes,
Waterproofs,
head torch,
blizzard survival bag,
route maps,
compass and whistle,
as no electronic maps were legal,
emergency rations,
a minimum of 1,000 calories,
minimum of 500 ml of water,
and an in-date first aid kit. This amounts to a heavy load, but also gives the impression that when you're out there,
it's the elements
and you.
Angus made a point of just how heavy all this gear became during 60 miles of hill running. As you may have guessed, for 3 or 4 days the runners get their sleep in between islands, and the sailors get theirs when the boat is stationary.
Angus explains the comfort level in the boat by telling us what they had on board.
It was just a plastic spoon you were allowed, or a plastic fork, and there was 1 plastic bucket, and that was it.
We just hope he meant each.
And that's you finished, if you're still alive.
Each island and the journey between brings a unique challenge to runners and sailors alike. Angus recalls his fascination with the work of the sailors on his team.
If you haven't sailed, then that experience of sailing through the Corrie Vrecken, you know, the whirlpool, there was an endless fascination I had because I wasn't brought up as a sailor particularly. It's like a game of chess, and certain bits of the, the guys would say, we need you back from that run within 4 hours. And if it was longer than that, that would meant you were going to miss the tide all the way down here. Just it's like snakes and ladders, this whole thing. And particularly if you're not comfortable about the subtleties of the sailing side of things, which I wasn't. It was just really fascinating to see how people making different decisions all the time. Do you go around this side of Jura, or do you go on the Atlantic side? Do you get a kick because the wind conditions have dropped, and you get a kick from the Corrie Vrecken whirlpool that kicks you through and down the Sound of Jura? So I just love talking to the particularly really good quality sailors and saying, why have you made that call? Why are we going this side, not that side? And you would find there would be a dozen reasons in their thinking. It's like a board game, right? We throw the dice and that happens. So there are all sorts of fascinating elements to the whole process.
After a number of years, Mr. Mac had fallen completely in love with the race. He wondered if they could enter some 5th and 6th years into the race and do some fundraising for the school.
Though at that time, the Islands Peaks race had no youth category, but that didn't seem like much of an obstacle for Angus.
And I talked to the organiser, Curly Mills, who is one of these guys who always says yes.
The junior racers would compete against the other teams on the same course, just with slightly altered rules to make the route more manageable for their age.
But that's a pretty stiff test for a 17-year-old kid. So fast forward to 1995, and it had built up a few years of experience of taking part in the race with senior pupils, and the amount of training that was required to get them to that level of fitness, and really loved all that.
In 1995, Angus and his team of 12 5th and 6th years were going for gold.
Christ called the unequipped, first, fishermen, men who had no formal education, who were looked down upon by higher society, but were strong and enduring. To follow him was to be guided through storms towards salvation.
Mr. Mack and his 12 were searching for the perfect vessel to sail into a world they knew was going to hurt.
In 1995, there were so many kids from the school that had applied, so there were a dozen that we'd been training since the beginning of the year for a May race, and they'd done a lot of miles, and I was looking for a boat that was bigger than the one that we'd used to date in order to accommodate them all, and eventually I ended up with a boat called Geronimo, which was an Admiral's Cup boat used in racing in the America Cup Series in the United States. When we started the race in 95, we were probably 2/3 of the way down the field after the Oban run, but by the time we'd got to the edge of the harbour, we were in second place, so that gives you a bit of an idea of what this flying machine was like. And we'd overtaken people, and that's always good fun. Encourage each other to push it. It's a race. Let's see what it takes. We were in first place by that stage, and were going like the clappers down the Sound of Jura towards Jura. And we were ahead of schedule by at least half an hour. The boat that we used wasn't that fast in the first few, so which was in retrospect quite a good thing, because you got a decent rest between one running leg and the next running leg. Didn't like this Geronimo thing that didn't give you time between. Come on guys, slow this thing down, will you? It's not on.
The prophet Isaiah says of God in chapter 25, "For you have been a refuge for the helpless, a defence for the needy in their distress, a shelter from the storm." Angus may have used these words to describe the boats of his previous races, but not Geronimo.
Aching legs and tired eyes, Angus was looking forward to what he expected would be his one decent rest, but before he knew it, he was woken abruptly from his dozy slumber and was rocking in his hammock. It was announced that it was time for him to run again. His stomach churned at the speed of Geronimo, and the thought of being out in the horrific weather battering against her. He couldn't help but dread his now very near future.
He knew before resting that he wouldn't have time to fully recover. Angus was absolutely exhausted from his previous run, and the idea of running again so soon was daunting. This story reminds us of chapter 5 of Luke's Gospel, when Jesus calls his first disciples.
Simon answered, "Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything, but because you say so, I will let down the nets." They must have been tired, but somehow they knew what was right.
For the new disciples and for Angus, what followed wasn't going to be easy.
So that was only about 3.5 to 4 hours at maximum after I'd run the first leg. So I had lactic acid, so my legs felt really heavy. When I poked my head up to go out and run this leg, it was dark, it was snowing, it was blowing a hoolie, it was just a full-on blizzard. And I was totally shattered from the previous leg, so I can't say I was looking forward to it as being a superb thing. And on top of that, I was very much responsible for the navigation for the team, as well as running and accompanying them. I was conscious that during training we'd had a couple of incidents in which we'd been running in blizzards, and 17-year-olds don't carry a lot of body fat on them mostly. So we'd had a couple of incidents which I was aware that there was slightly uncontrollable shivering amongst the kids. So I was we were fine. We dealt with it, but I was conscious of the fact that kids and blizzards wearing shorts is not a great combination. And that given the fact that it was dark and in a blizzard, that navigation was definitely going to be an issue that would slow us down significantly. So that was kind of looming quite strongly in the back of my mind.
On their way up and into the hills, the blizzard turned to a whiteout in May.
We managed to get the first checkpoint without too much of a problem because it was on top of a mountain, so you basically keep going upwards if you hit the base of the mountain. But the second checkpoint was on a small lochen in a fairly featureless area, so there were no kind of guide rails that could get you there. You just had to hit this thing to get this checkpoint, and if not, you're invalidated.
Angus could no longer see more than 5 yards ahead of him. Aiming for the lock and checkpoint, he started using the students as tools when taking compass bearings.
Angus's responsibility was to guide, and the students' responsibility was to follow. During his ministry, Jesus had to exercise a lot of patience with the unknowing disciples, and they were to endure the outcomes of following him.
This is what the Lord says, your Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel. I am the Lord your God, who teaches you what is best for you, who directs you in the way you should go. Isaiah 48:17.
So I had to slow everything down. I was taking compass bearings, sending kids off about 5 yards ahead, which was maximum visibility, getting to there, sending another one on with a bearing, and the kids were getting pretty cold.
Angus was conscious that the students had started to show signs of hypothermia. With no time to stop and celebrate the little victories,
we managed to get the checkpoint, and we set off and managed to get to the next checkpoint, which was on top of a hill, so that was relatively straightforward.
After fighting their way through the thick mist, about 200 yards from the top, the blizzard cleared. Salvation.
We got to the top of the hill, and it was one of these moments where the image is still just embedded in my mind. I can see the picture, and it's the sun rising in the distance, looking down from the top of a mountain onto the Sound of Jura, the odd white sail in the distance. Just 2 or 3 boats, I can't remember exactly, down in the bay at Craighouse. So we knew that we were really well placed and that it was downhill down to the thing. And, the warmth of the sun and running downhill warmed everybody up, and everyone was really buoyant. So after the stress of the darkness and the cold and the blizzard, that had all cleared, and this really euphoric experience of running downhill knowing you're in a good position.
No doubt feeling they were earning it, everyone in the team hungered for the taste of victory. Soon enough they were docking at Arran, the final island. One more run and one more sail.
So we got round to Arran and to Lamlash Bay, and we knew that the second team was an Irish World Cup team, so that these were really formidable hill athletes. And at that stage I had a problem with a knee injury which didn't help, but I had another adult with me that was able to take the kids to the top and back. And about a mile and a half from the finish, this Irish World Cup team had overtaken our youngsters and were probably about 5 minutes ahead of them.
Angus's injury turned his desire for a break into a necessity. After a short rest while the others tackled the second last leg, Angus was leading the charge to take back their place in front of the Irish team. It was here that one of Mr. Mack's youngsters, Paddy, really started struggling.
And he just said, I am totally shattered. I cannot put one foot in front of another. I've had it. And I said to him stuff that probably would not be totally politically correct nowadays, but by a great deal of inverted commas encouragement, and by carrying his rucksack for him, we managed to get Patrick down to the finish line at about 1.5 miles away. He kept running when he said, I just cannot do it.
On the night that Jesus was betrayed, he prayed, Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done.
It was the will of Mr. Mac, not the will of Paddy, that got the team over the line.
And he flopped on board the boat like a beach whale and said, Mr. Mac, I will never, ever. And I kind of filled in the dots because he stopped speaking after I will never, ever. And I thought, stop hating your guts or do that again or whatever. But what he said was, I will never, ever forget the lesson I've learnt today about what I'm capable of when I thought I wasn't. So we managed to get to the finish line in first place eventually, and were then disqualified, which was for a technical thing back in Craighouse in Jura, and it didn't make any difference whatsoever to how we felt and what we had experienced. So the technicality of whether you won the race or not, which I thought was important prior to it, actually wasn't. It wasn't important at all. And it'd always been about taking part in lessons and things, but it's only when you're in a position of, we can win this thing, and you suddenly realise, actually, that's not so important.
Despite the team not being awarded first place, Paddy really did remember the lesson he'd learned from the race.
Not long after the Island Peaks race, Paddy visited Angus in his office
and said, I had stories from you about being in the Karakoram Mountains in Pakistan and climbing there. And
Paddy wanted to follow in Mr. Mac's footsteps after he left school.
So he said, I would like to go to the Karakoram. And I said, well, narrow it down for me. And he said, well, the Swat Valley, there's a teaching post for teaching English in the Swat Valley. And I had experienced the Swat Valley and advised him against it and said, this is a really hostile, fundamentalist Muslim area. The word Taliban wasn't that common in those days. We're talking about the 1990s. But I said there are illegal groups of terrorists in that territory.
Despite the growing tensions there, the obvious danger, and of Angus's warnings.
And he said, no, I ain't taking your advice. So he disappeared off to the Swat Valley.
The student is not above the teacher, but everyone who is fully trained will be like their teacher. Luke chapter 6, verse 40.
When I met him on his return, he told me a story about how at the end of his year he had gone trekking with his friend who was of a similar age, and they'd gone through this mountain pass that was about 16,000 feet, 17,000 feet. It was waist deep in snow, and his friend had food poisoning and dysentery. And I think there may be a little bit of hyperbole involved in his statement about, I took him on my shoulders and carried him out of there. But what he did say was that he was tested like he'd never been tested before. And he says, I am remembering the Island Peaks race. And he said he knew that he could do it because of the experience that he'd had at that particular time. So that helped, amongst other things, to reinforce what I had already felt was the case, that the most important element of being involved in education was to help to develop the character of the people concerned.
Then we will no longer be infants tossed back and forth by the waves, and blown here and there by every wind of teaching, and by the cunning and craftiness of people in their deceitful scheming. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 14.
What started as a fundraising effort became the catalyst for more expeditions that would push the young people out of their comfort zones. After the success of his sailing and running ventures with the students, Angus came up with a new idea.
The Island Peaks race was a trigger moment, taking part in that.
After hearing their classmates' stories from the Peaks race, we couldn't help but wonder how many teenagers would really be interested in any more of Angus's ideas. But according to him, there's no lack of demand.
I didn't have to convince kids because it was word of mouth. And I think part of it is that you are, as I think I've touched on already, that you're testing yourself physically and mentally in a way that you would not do ordinarily. You're out in nature, you're testing yourself, you know, people would say once they'd experienced it, a bit like myself, once I've experienced it, then you got more enthusiastic as that went along.
When Jesus saw the crowd around him, he gave orders to cross to the other side of the lake. Then a teacher of the law came to him and said, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." Jesus replied, "Foxes have dens and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." Matthew 8:18-20.
That was enough to get 20 secondary school students on a canoe trip to Canada in the year 2000.
The object of the exercise was to have an adventure. Mostly you were looking at 5th, 6th year who were right at the end of their school career, so it was to give them a really memorable experience. But it was to take them into nature, to take them away from iPhones, to get them to work together, to experience things they would never experience otherwise in their lives. So the objectives were multifarious. Apart from anything else, I wanted to have a really good fun canoe expedition in places that I probably wouldn't have gone to unless I had, a purpose for going there. I'd initially kicked off, I'd always wanted to climb Mount Kilimanjaro, and I thought, right, good excuse to get the kids up there. But when I floated that as an idea, I didn't have enough youngsters wanting to do it. And it's a pretty formidable challenge, to be honest, for a 16, 17-year-old anyhow. But, I was up for doing it with kids, but I think they thought that was too much of a trump. So I then thought about doing Canadian canoeing, and immediately there was a really big positive response. Kids wanted to do it.
Fueled by his own desire to experience new places and his knowledge that these challenges can be great character-building experiences for young people,
Angus had a plan to travel to Canada and canoe down the Harricana River into the Hudson Bay. It would be him, a few other members of staff, an outdoor instructor named Francis, and 20 teenage students, including Angus's daughter, for 2 weeks of nothing but canoeing and camping.
And the youngsters would be in Canadian canoes, open canoes, so pairs, boys, girls. They would raise approximately, in those days, about £2,500 each, and they did it by all sorts of joint enterprises, but also giving up, that would be their birthday money and their Christmas money, and get sponsorship from aunts and uncles and all that side of things. But I was very keen that they didn't just say, "Hey Mum, would you pay for me to go to Canada?" or "Hey Dad, would you?" That they earned the money, because that was part of the learning process, and the appreciation process. If you go through quite a bit of trouble, then I think you appreciate why you spent that money and what it's for.
This may have been the first time these young people experienced sacrifice for something greater, an idea familiar to all who follow Jesus. In Matthew 6:21, Jesus urged his followers to keep their sights away from earthly prizes, saying, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also."
Angus had learned all about getting young people fit enough to run the Island Peaks race, but training them for canoeing in Canada was going to be something else.
So there was a fair bit of preparation for it, and I was supported by staff that wanted to take part in what was a pretty good adventure. So we then spent a lot of winter days, actually. I remember breaking ice on the Tay and various things, training these youngsters out. We spent a lot of weekends away and doing various rivers in Scotland. And there was a lot of training involved in it.
Of course, you don't get kids to raise thousands of pounds and train for months just to ship them off for a physical challenge. Angus was keen that this would be a memorable trip in more ways than one for the young people.
And it was the River Harricanor, which flows into the James Bay, which is a bay off the bottom of the Hudson Bay in the far north of Canada. And I have to say, it was a pretty tough baptism for these kids, and in many ways that was, and in retrospect as well, that was a really good thing. It's what makes an impact is when you're tested. So the expedition was no phones, no electronic devices at all, because you're A, got no signal, and B, you'll ruin them because you're in a canoe. Take away your mechanical devices and stuff from kids and put them together for 10 days to a fortnight. And what fun they had. It was fun, actually. That's the real reason. Scrub all the rest of that stuff. Just fun. Good fun.
So here they were on the school's first of many, Angus hoped, big expedition to another country, and they were having a fantastic time. They'd spend every day canoeing down rapids and taking in views, and every evening camping by the river, ticking off the days while wishing they would never run out.
For other people who remember their own grueling teenage hill walking expeditions on Duke of Edinburgh, it sounds like this trip was nothing like that.
But it wasn't all fun and games on the river. After exercising their problem-solving skills a fair few times since setting off, halfway through the expedition, a minor and forgivable mistake would prove to alter the trip entirely.
About halfway through, we'd done a lot of big and scary rapids. We'd had some really quite difficult things, lessons learnt, etc., etc. But this particular afternoon, early afternoon, we'd had a lunch stop on a small island. The sun was shining. For some reason, everybody was in good humour, good mood.
The advice, be on your guard, appears many times throughout the New Testament. Angus and his youngsters were about to learn the meaning of this advice.
So when we set off after lunch, we were perhaps a little careless in terms of the distribution of the canoes. We normally left a good gap between each canoe, so if something happened to one canoe, the other wouldn't run into it. And I was in the lead canoe with Francis, and we didn't really check behind us as we should have done, and we heard the triple whistle go as we were entering some relatively okay rapids.
Angus and Francis knew to turn around at the sound of the emergency whistle. They looked back to discover almost half of their total 12 canoes capsized, and 8 people swimming in the 16-mile-per-hour river.
And one canoe had coped, the one immediately next to it had gone into it, it coped. So there were in total, I think, 4 canoes had all capsized at the same time. Now the River Harricanor is probably about 3 times the width of the River Tay down at Perth. It flows really strongly. So to have 8 swimmers and the 4 canoes with all the gear was a significant challenge. And we prioritised, obviously, getting the kids to shore. One of the canoes happened to be one that had a member of staff in, so she managed to organise and help the other kid get to shore. She was a PE teacher, she was a strong swimmer. So then Francis and I, having rescued the kids, we had the logistics of trying to get these canoes full of gear for a 2-week expedition.
After Angus and Francis had pulled the remaining kids from the river into their own canoe and ushered them to shore, they had to turn around and try to catch the runaway boats that had all the kids' gear in them.
Somehow either into land or just rescued. And we could see that the power of the water was taking them away from us pretty rapidly. But I also was aware that after rescuing these kids and dragging them on board the canoe, that we had taken on board a lot of water. So we were probably half full of water, if not slightly more. We got hold of the first of the canoes that was going down there and tried to drag it across the bows. And it's full of gear, so this is a really heavy load. And in the process of doing that, we took on board more water. So Francis from the back said, we're going to sink. And I said, well, yeah.
Angus had had a bad feeling about rushing off for the runaway canoes without stopping first to empty the water they'd gathered from saving the kids. Here he looked back and regretted not following his instinct.
Anyhow, we sank just because we were too full of water. And Francis started swimming for the shore. He was a good swimmer. I wasn't as strong a swimmer and was back paddling and trying to look around with help was probably... I don't know if you think terribly much on these occasions. You tend to act a bit more instinctively. But however, Francis realised he wasn't going to make shore, and he came back towards me, and I had spotted a rock sticking just above. What I saw from the spray coming up into the air was a huge waterfall. It was frightening. The nearer you got to it, the more the noise of the waterfall. And of course, you didn't know how big it was or anything, but you could tell from the spray and the noise that this was a big waterfall, and you didn't want to be anywhere near it. So I saw this rock on the top of it and swam towards it, and luckily managed to get one arm on it and managed to reach get a grip on that, and flopped over the top of the rock with my body, and turned around to look for Francis and saw him desperately trying to make the same rock, but the current was sweeping him past it, and I reached a hand out to touch his, and our fingers crossed overlapped by about half an inch, but I'm not sure even if I'd been able to grip his wrist and hand as to whether I could have pulled him in or not. I don't know, because the current was really strong. And there was a horrific look on his face as he realised he was going over this waterfall. Again, there's a visual image I've got which is a bit like Munch's Scream. You've seen the painting? I've never experienced even looking at what that must have been like for the guy. And he disappeared over the waterfall. I scrambled on top of the rock, was able to get a bit of an idea of what he'd gone over and how formidable it was, and I just thought, that's him, he's dead. You can't survive what he's gone over. And I just stood looking down for what seemed like an age. It seemed like a minute, but it was probably in reality slightly less. And his head popped up about 150 yards downstream, and I thought it was just the life jacket that we had, or the life belt that was keeping him afloat, because he was still. And then he started to move, and he managed to get into shore. So I was hugely relieved that the poor guy was clearly okay. But it was stuck in this rock in the middle of the island.
When teaching me to climb as a child, my dad would often have to remind me of the danger of standing on a ledge and how it kills your willingness to continue up the rock. Not tempted to risk his own fate down the waterfall, Angus must have felt a much more real combination of comfort and helplessness.
The rest of their party had grown concerned for the two of them, and had started travelling downriver on foot.
Angus and Francis had started the rescue, but quickly became in need of one themselves.
That the kids pulled together, the staff pulled together.
The students and remaining staff eventually found Angus and managed to rescue him from the rock to the shore, and soon all, including Francis, were back together at camp.
Having failed to rescue the runaway canoes, but thankfully all have escaped with their lives, the group were now 5 canoes down, which meant 10 people, including Angus and Francis, were without any of their stuff.
Jesus replied, "Foxes have dens and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." Matthew 8:20.
Francis was out of it. He was in a state of shock. He wasn't able to operate really for probably a day and a half, 2 days. And we had some really difficult, it was an interesting night in retrospect because you were trying to prioritize. There were some wet and shocked kids who had been swimming. It was now night time, it was raining, it was cold. So you were prioritizing fire, shelter, but knowing that some of the tents in 5 canoes now, because ours was the 5th, were not in action, so people were having to double up and treble up on sleeping bags, just try and provide spare clothing, dry clothing, food.
If there's one thing I remember about being a teenager on a camping trip, it's that while the adults worried about things like food and shelter, the top of my priority list was always going to be fun. So I wouldn't be surprised if this next revelation was all thanks to the kids.
The other element that was quite significant, which I'm not sure was originally planned, but it certainly emerged, was that when we'd lost some of the canoes, we had a big communal fire, and everybody was around the communal fire. And we said, that works. That works. Not each little pair doing their own thing. And so subsequently we always had a campfire, and we always sat around it at night. Now, how often do you get the opportunity as a 16, 17-year-old to spend 10 days to 2 weeks round a fire chatting about life, about anything under the sun? You look up at a sky in the north of Canada without a cloud in the sky, and if you're not profoundly moved and not enabled to think about yourself in comparison to the universe, then when are you going to do that?
Comparing yourself to the pure magnitude of creation, it is hard not to view yourself as inconsequential. In a way, there is a beauty to that. We have been lucky enough to witness firsthand that which has been sculpted by an omnipotent God. The prophet Jeremiah begins a prayer to our Lord with, "Ah, sovereign Lord, you have made the heavens and the earth by your great power and outstretched arm. Nothing is too hard for you."
From how Angus describes their behaviour, it's possible that the young people were profoundly moved by these moments under the night sky.
So, it was really an interesting process of kids pulling together, realizing the seriousness of the situation, that there was, although we had an emergency phone that we could have contacted a helicopter if we needed to in the case of breakage, we decided not to activate it because nobody was dead, fortunately, or injured. And then the next day when we set off and tried to rescue these canoes, we managed to rescue 3 out of the 5. We lost 2 totally, because just down from this waterfall was 7 Mile Island, which Finn correctly said was 7 miles long. And we didn't want to split the party up and go either side of it, so we chose what we thought was the most likely, and we got 3 out of the 5, which wasn't bad. But we were therefore short of supplies and short of canoes and all the equipment.
After all their training and preparation, it turned out that the rapids wouldn't be their biggest challenge. The kids not only got to learn how they would react in an emergency situation, but they also learned how to carry on without a great deal of the stuff they surely deemed essential.
And I particularly remember the stoicism of a guy called Stevie, who had just joined the school, and we had invited him on the expedition, who had put his spare contact lenses in the 2 canoes that we didn't recover from. So he was virtually blind for the rest of the trip, and he never complained, just got on with the job, and I think earned huge respect from his fellow pupils, that if you wanted a guy to bed himself into a social grouping that he hadn't been a member of. And boy, was that, did he earn the respect of his peer group. So that was one of many pluses.
Angus remembers the other kids teasing the poor boy by pointing out great sights he wasn't able to see, their good-natured yet cruel way of welcoming him into the fold.
And the other interesting one was that there was a set of rapids further down, which was, it was fairly testing, but we'd gone through worse or more difficult. And I had, appreciating that the confidence of a lot of the youngsters had been affected, we said, look, we can portage this, we can pick up the canoes, carry it around, or you can go through it, but there is utterly, if you would rather portage this thing, total respect, and you've got to be upfront about the fact that you're scared. And a couple of the big laddies who are, the sort of macho type kids just said, sorry, Mr. Mac, I'm scared shitless, pardon the French. And said, we're going to portage. And that takes quite a lot for a macho 17-year-old boy to admit that they're scared.
Sometimes there are few things more scary than admitting your own fear. We like to fancy ourselves totally independent and capable without need, and especially not from God. There's nothing strong about refusing to accept your need for help.
Psalm 34, 4-5. I sought the Lord, and he answered me. He delivered me from all my fears. Those who look to him are radiant. Their faces are never covered with shame.
Everyone, especially those in charge, were no doubt thankful that nothing quite so eventful happened for the rest of the trip.
Another important lesson from my dad was that every good expedition ends at the pub. But we can't argue with Angus's choice of venue after hearing about their eating habits on the river.
A 16, 17-year-old boy can eat if they're up at 6 o'clock, working hard all day in the outdoors and finishing at 8 o'clock at night. They can eat 1 ton of food, and a celery stick and a carrot for lunch is not good crack. So one of the reasons that we were shattered at the end of the Harricano trip, and it was quite an emotional trip, and a very, very physical trip, a lot of headwinds that we were having to canoe against, but we were starving. And one of the sites, I didn't tell you about this before, was, I think, everybody had lost a minimum of a stone and some more than that. And it was, you appreciate, boy, if you don't get the calories in, you get tired. Boy, you get tired. So one of the great sights was we got across to an Indian settlement near Churchill, a place called Moosonee, and there was a McDonald's there. Well, have you seen a 17-year-old starving boy, and literally starving? These guys were queuing up. I have never seen the size of the orders that these guys, 3 Big Macs, 3 triple burgers, and that would be for starters, the guys were going, it's like a cartoon watching these guys consuming this food. I must admit, I did indulge as well. So it was great, yeah.
It's not uncommon to hear God's word referred to as spiritual food. Angus and his team learned all too well about the importance of feeding yourself enough, and the effects of failing to do so on their expedition to Canada.
I find that when I spend periods of time not prioritising the pursuit of God, it's a bit like being hangry. I'm not putting myself in a position to be the person I want to be.
When those times come, feast on the splendour of God's glory and be full again.
I think one of the interesting things from the end of that exercise was the number of parents when I got home that said their kids had been totally transformed by they said, we don't know what went on out there, but my son or daughter has grown up overnight. They're helping around the house, they're being communicative, they're being helpful, they're being positive.
It's safe to say that Angus's experiment had been a huge success, and that trip to Canada would end up being the first of many for the school.
They repeated the expeditions annually, always going to new places to do different things.
I remember a particular thing in Norway and Sweden where they were on this small island, and we heard wolf crying in the distance. So the guys that we were with, saying about what good swimmers wolves were, and then we were making wolf prints in the sand and howling in the middle of the night, and just nonsense stuff that was going on. Just good fun stuff. It was fun.
Though Angus could never tame his fascination with Canada.
And we had on the mountain river in the Yukon, we had to use helicopters to evacuate kids, both through injury and because of the flood conditions. So these were not picnics that they were going on.
And the school kept encouraging his trips there with the students. He remembers one trip to Baffin Island in the furthest northeast of Canada.
And we had stopped down this river for lunch or whatever, and he said, right, we're going to climb that mountain. So we duly climbed the mountain. When I got to the top of the mountain, it wasn't a huge mountain, and it was fairly round-topped. I said to the kids, right, go out by yourself, don't be near anyone else, and just spend 5 minutes just enjoying where you are. Just enjoy this wilderness landscape. You're on Baffin Island, you are 1,000 miles away from home or anything else. Just go and contemplate, think, do whatever. And I think it was Anna that said to me, you will never get, 17-year-old kids to say, stay quiet for 5 minutes. I looked at my watch after 10 minutes. They were still silent.
This exercise was about more than just taking in the view. Though Angus had no spiritual purpose when instructing the young people to intentionally spend time alone, quiet and still, we can't help but remember the famous line in Psalm 46, "Be still and know that I am God."
There were 2 girls walking down the hill behind me, and they came up and said, that was the most profound experience we've ever had in our lives. And one girl said, I don't think I've ever been silent like that in a wilderness area in my life. And she said, I was blown away just by being there. So I couldn't have predicted that, Beth. I wouldn't have known that would happen. I wouldn't have known they would have had that experience. But some instinct told me just to tell them, go off and just be. Just be and look around you and start thinking. So we actually spent quite a lot of time and effort subsequent to those experiences trying to develop a program that embedded the development of character within every aspect of how the school operated. So giving responsibility towards running things to pupils. So we tried really hard to hand over responsibility to the youngsters in running things. And I am quite convinced that you got responsible youngsters as a result of giving responsibility. But as adults, you have to learn to give away that power, control, don't know what the right word is, but you have to be big enough to risk giving that empowerment to the youngsters, and then you will get so much more than you ever would dream of out of them.
Jesus taught his followers to serve one another. It is well known that he washed his disciples' feet, and in John's Gospel, when preparing them for his absence, Jesus says, "Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet." The students would have to learn to be without their teacher.
And it is increasingly difficult to put young people into situations where I think they will learn about themselves. And I kind of think that's a pretty important thing that you need to have, particularly as a teenager. That you need to know what you're capable of and what you can do.
After seeing so many changed individuals as a result of the expeditions, Angus became passionate that the school be a place of character development as well as academia.
He made a point of keeping an eye on the students, aiming to prevent any from slipping through the cracks. He told us a touching story about a boy who struggled academically and socially, that once invested in by the staff and consequently receiving a prize for his poetry, was never again seen slouching to avoid eye contact or staring at notice boards through awkwardness.
In Luke chapter 15, Jesus tells the parable of the lost sheep, saying, "Suppose one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of them. Doesn't he leave the 99 in the open country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it? And when he finds it, he joyfully puts it on his shoulders."
This young boy who was least likely to engage and ask for guidance was the one that needed it most.
Angus may not have been a Christian during his career, but he certainly acted as the students' rabbi in residence, leading them, walking alongside them, and building them up. These days, he has the humility and strength of faith to attribute it all to the grace of God.
God has a hand in stuff, as you know.
Thank you for listening to the Divine Nature podcast,
And thank you to Angus MacDonald for sharing his stories.
and for the flapjack he brought us when we interviewed him.
If you have a story lead or guest idea, let us know by sending us an email at divinenaturepodcast@gmail.com.
To never miss a new episode, you can now subscribe to our newsletter. Find the link in the episode description, or just email us saying you want to opt in.
May you be blessed by the Lord.
The maker of heaven and earth.
Amen.